So, I'm here to tell you guys about the Freeborn Exchange, which is an alternative economy that I created. Basically, in November 2011, I set off on a journey around the world through 14 countries in 12 months. And that journey was inspired by artists of old who bartered their creativity in order to survive. So I was inspired to barter my photography, talent and skills. I shouldn't say talent, but skills. It's up to you whether you think it's talent. And I exchanged that and also promotion through social media for accommodation, stories, other skills and objects and more around the world. I did that for a year and afterwards I moved to London, but it didn't stop there. Although I came back into full-time work, the exchanges continued. So now I'm just going to show you guys a selection of my favourite Freeborn exchanges so far. Thank you. So I met Rani Som in Siem Reap in Cambodia. Rani is a jewellery designer, and we proposed a sunrise fashion shoot at Angkor Wat Temple. So in exchange for these images, which Rani then used to market her business, she gave me some of her wonderful jewellery, which is made from the seeds of plants and trees from around Angkor Wat Temple. This is Ken Kita and his family. Ken is a young Japanese businessman who works in the travel industry. A lot of people told me before I went to Japan that there was no way that the Japanese would invite me in their homes because they're very private. In actual fact, I travelled there for an entire month, and every night I had a host. Sometimes I'd stay with them for a few nights. So I found very, very open as a culture. I'll never forget the taste of Ken's wife's homemade Mishu wine from that particular stay. And of course, our exchange was family portraiture in return for accommodation and hospitality. By reputation, I had heard on my travels of Johnny Hillwalker. Johnny Hillwalker is an English-speaking Japanese tour guide who's been all over the world. Now, in his 80s, he's semi-retired. He only gives 3-hour walking tours through the hills of Kyoto in Japan, around 2 to 3 times a week. And they're quite well known. So I got in touch with Johnny Hillwalker, and I proposed that I would have access to his walking tour in return for live marketing through my social media of Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. So I want to tell you about the story of and introduce you to Petra's father-in-law. I met Petra when I was on an agricultural tour at 18 years of age in Belgium, and it was in Leuven. So 16 years later, after we'd lost touch, we found each other on Facebook, and by this time Petra had become engaged and had a newborn baby. Petra followed my project of the Freeborn Exchange through social media whilst I was travelling, and she admired many of the family portraits that I made. I said to her, maybe I'll be passing through Hungary towards the end of the trip, and indeed I did. During my stay and our time together, Petra took me to her father-in-law's farm. Being from a farm myself in Ireland, I had a natural affinity with her father, and I made this portrait of him. As I made this portrait, he looked at me and he said, "In Hungary, we have a saying, if a man is not 100 kilos, he is not a man." So he's certainly got a giggle out of me. What a great character. This image was made at Latitude Festival in Suffolk, where I met Rob Francis. We were watching John Grant, the musician, play his set. I made this portrait at the edge of the tent afterwards, and I let Rob borrow my sombrero because I just needed a little bit more shade to make the portrait. We connected on Twitter and stayed in touch briefly, and lo and behold, 18 months later, Rob turns up at my workplace, Chelsea College of Arts, where he now works as a mentor, and believe it or not, his office is opposite mine. So I mentioned to Rob, I said, I've got this beautiful portrait of you, and he said, you've got that Freeborn Exchange project, so I need to think, what am I going to exchange? I said, don't worry about it. I said, you can have the portrait. I said, it's cool. So he came back to me and he said, I bought you a ticket to see John Grant in London with me and my friends. So it came full circle. I met Rachel King in London Fields Park in Hackney, just after I moved to London. Now, most of you know moving to London can be a little bit stressful, so it was quite fortuitous that I should meet a Thai masseuse. Rachel trained, lived and worked in Chiang Mai in Thailand, which I'd actually travelled through as well a number of months previous. So I made portraits of Rachel's practice, and those portraits were exchanged for Thai massage, which certainly helped me to settle into London. I also promoted her throughout my social media. I've got a particular interest in the Irish diaspora around the world, and I travelled to Jamaica, and whilst I was in Jamaica exploring Irish and African mixed heritage, a route taxi dropped me off one night at the wrong address, and it turned out that the people who lived there were the Thompson family. This is Lennon Stafford Thompson I, and it turned out in conversation that his great-great-great-grandfather was full-blood white Irish. So I was very interested in this, and also in his surname, because it happens to be my grandmother's surname. So the next day, when I found out they had a farm, I said, pick me up at 7 a.m, let's go farming. So we were going to cut some grass for the cows. It turned out to be 12 foot tall, rather different to cutting grass in Ireland. Cuban king grass. And there were many things we shared in common. I Skyped my parents from the phone after we'd come in for some food, and I said, Mum, Dad, meet the cousins, whilst they faced two 6'3", 6'4" Jamaican guys. Yes, it was quite entertaining, so we all enjoyed that. I travelled to Brooklyn in New York to visit a friend who's up next, actually, the next image. And whilst I was there, I was adventuring around Brooklyn and I came across Charlie's Calypso record store. Now, I'd been in Jamaica just beforehand, and I'd been picking up the Patois dialect, which is heavily influenced by the Irish accent, the way that they say everything will be alright, and this and that. So I joined in the conversation with this gentleman and his colleagues in the record store, which they found quite entertaining. And I found out that this is Charlie of Charlie's Record Store, and that upstairs in his studio he had recorded some of the world's greatest calypso and soca hits. I asked to make his portrait upstairs in the studio, and in return for the portrait and for promotion of his store, of course, he exchanged some vinyl records. As I mentioned, I was there to visit a friend in New York. This is Joey Finn, who's a fine arts student at the time, and she was basically on exchange at Parsons in New York. So I'd gone to stay with her. Our exchange was hospitality in return for portraits of her in her temporary neighbourhood. This is Anna Minshaw. I met Anna Minshaw when I was an artist at the Passport to Pimlico May Day event in London. She's quite a striking lady, and I wanted to make this portrait of her. It turned out that she's also a tango dancer, so guess what we exchanged? Portrait for? Tango. Excellent. So I have a tango lesson coming up soon. Hanami Nishi is a Japanese graduate textile designer who spent 5 years studying in the UK and travelling in Europe. I made this portrait and others in Crystal Palace one Sunday afternoon in the summertime. And our exchange was some of Hanami's wonderful artwork in return for the portraits and promotion of her practice before she headed back to Japan. This is Rosie Jolly. I met Rosie Jolly at Halloween in Brixton. A colourful night, as you can see. Rosie works in the film industry, and because she loved the portrait and she wanted to make an exchange, she sent me a really big box of popcorn in return for it, which it took me a while to get through. Oh, too strong again. Okay, this is Frank Bowling, OBE-RA. Frank is a Chelsea College of Arts alumni, and he was the first Royal Academician, first Black Royal Academician to be made in 2005. Frank's fine art practice, painting practice, has been made between London and New York. And in fact, in the 1980s, Frank made his own exchange at the famous artist hub Chelsea Hotel, where he painted for his board. In return for this portrait, which Frank's gallery now uses to represent him around the world, and which he has, of course, personally, his wife, Rachel Scott, who's a textile artist, made me a small textile sausage dog animal brooch, which I cherish dearly. This is Festus. Festus is a bike mechanic and a DJ. So we met in London, and our exchange, of course, he helped me fix my bike. And he also sent me a wonderful mix on SoundCloud of his music. And finally, this is Dan Hernandez. Dan Hernandez is a performance artist. I negotiated access to Dan's performance, and in return, Dan got the images of the performance, which he then used to promote his practice. So I would like you to stop and think. The next time you have an idea, the next time you want to make something happen, stop and think to yourself, what's your alternative currency? What sort of alternative economy could you create? Thank you for your time today.